Chapter 9 Commencement. Fort Necessity, a mile south of the Jumonville skirmish, Pennsylvania Territory, summer 1754. In preparation for avenging their fallen brothers, the French bolstered their force with an additional 100 Shawnee, Mingo, and Delaware warriors. Ironically, their new allies are the same warriors who had previously aligned with the British. Meanwhile, knowing full well the French will retaliate, Washington places his men on high alert, ordering them to dig defensive positions while they continue to expedite the construction of Fort Necessity. Washington's move proves to be a prudent one. In late June, he receives word from an Indian ally of the bolstered French force and their goal of driving the Virginians out of the Ohio River Valley. The morning of Wednesday, July 3rd, 1754. Just days after meeting with his Indian ally, the French unleashed their forces on Fort Necessity. Although Washington anticipated the attack and his men are ready, they quickly find themselves outmatched, outnumbered by nearly 4 to 1. Despite their preparations and putting forth their best defense, the Virginians are also fighting another enemy, Mother Nature. To their dismay, an afternoon deluge swallows their tiny fort. Their defensive trenches filling with water, Washington's forces are quickly drenched and trudging through a muddy bog. The downpour severely dampening their ammunition and any hope of defending their position. Recognizing their situation for what it is, Washington reluctantly surrenders. The Battle of Fort Necessity is lost. The French make Washington a familiar-sounding offer. Leave the Forks for a year, and they will be allowed to safely walk away. Having no alternative, Washington accepts their terms. As part of the negotiations, he signs a formal surrender. However, the document, which is written in French, includes an admission to murdering, the French envoy. Since the closest thing Washington has to an interpreter is a soldier of Belgian descent, he unknowingly signs the document. Later, the French government will use the document as justification for engaging in the war. The following morning, Thursday, July 4th, 1754. As Washington and his men retreat in humiliation, word of his dismay quickly spreads. Following their retreat, the French destroy the fort. In an ironic twist, the British defeat at Fort Necessity also costs the half-king his clout with the surrounding tribes and their councils. They knew, had they chosen to align with one side or the other as the half-king had done, they risked having to fight other Indians, something they simply did not want to do. While at the same time, had they chosen to remain neutral, they risked losing their beloved Ohio Territory to one side or the other. It was simply a no-win situation for the half-king or the other tribes. After his defeat, Washington returns to Winchester, where he establishes a new headquarters. Shortly thereafter, he leases Mount Vernon from his brother's widow, Anne Fairfax, making it his permanent home. The Bonner Farm, Monday morning, September 23rd, 1754. In the wee hours, the cold winds sweep over William's old cabin as another baby is being born. With Berta and Mary Elizabeth assisting, Doc talks Flora through her contractions.
"That's good, lass. You're doing good."
Breathing heavily, Flora glares at him weary-eyed.
"All right, lassie. He's almost here. Now give me one more good push. Just one more."
Exhausted, Flora throws her head on the pillow, gazing at Mary, who says,
"Just one more push, Flora. You can do it. Come on now. Give me your best. He's almost here."
Flora squeezes her hand and pushes with all that she is, giving birth to a healthy baby boy. As Doc places the newborn upon her chest, she aptly names him Jeremiah Connolly, Jr. The Ohio River Valley, Ohio Territory, 11 days later, Friday, October 4th, 1754. Longtime friend to the British Crown and the man whose actions arguably started the French and Indian War, the Seneca half-king, Chief Tenetcherissen, is found dead. Alexandria, along the shores of the Potomac River, Virginia colony, a few months later. Winter, 1755. The British Army's Commander-in-Chief, Major General Edward Braddock, is a field officer experienced in the art of European warfare, and he has every intention of putting that experience to use against the French. He is preparing to lead an expeditionary force of 1,300 to the Ohio Forks and capture Fort Duquesne at modern-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now a lieutenant colonel, Washington seeks to finish what he started, volunteering to serve on the expedition. However, upon learning he will always be outranked by even the most junior of British regular army officers, he finds himself in an unsettling position. Making matters worse is the troubling manner in which British regular army officers openly express their disdain of provincial officers and troops of the militia. Although beyond infuriating, Washington is determined to avenge his loss. Hence, he elects to serve the expedition not as a provincial officer, but rather as an unpaid volunteer. His role, that of General Braddock's personal aide-de-camp. Spring, 1755. With his forces supplied and mustered, Braddock launches the expedition. With him leading the way, they march in formation from Alexandria to Fort Cumberland, Maryland. With their heavy artillery and extraordinarily long supply train, progress comes slowly. Nevertheless, making their way down the road Washington's men cleared the previous year, they arrive at Fort Cumberland on Saturday, May 10th. Upon their arrival, General Braddock's men refresh their supplies, then continue their march to the Monongahela River. Sadly, their progress to the river is slower still. In June, as the expedition crawls along, Washington falls ill with a bout of dysentery, making the journey nearly unbearable. His suffering so extreme, he is forced to travel on his back in the bed of a wagon at the rear of the column. The Western Frontier, Monongahela River, 10 miles south of Fort Duquesne, Pennsylvania Territory, summer, Tuesday, July 8, 1755. By the time Washington recovers enough to rejoin Braddock at the head of the column, the expedition is already nearing the Monongahela. Upon his arrival, he attempts to mount his horse, but the pain is so severe he is forced to strap blankets to the saddle, without which he is unable to ride. Despite the excruciating pain, he mounts his steed and returns to Braddock's side. Meanwhile, the French at Fort Duquesne, who have been anticipating a British response, are well prepared, ready, and waiting. Furthermore, their commander, Francois Coulon de Villiers, yet another brother of the slain Jumonville, has already sent out patrols hell-bent on locating the British column in advance of their arrival. And locate them they do. The early hours of Wednesday, July 9th, 1754. One of Villiers' patrols spots the British column approaching the Monongahela, and the patrol leader sends a messenger back to Fort Duquesne, alerting their commander of the approaching column. Hoping to return the favor and ambush his adversary, Villiers dispatches a force of 108 French regulars, 146 militia, and 637 natives to crush the British. Unfortunately, Their arrival to the Brits' location is delayed, and they run headlong into Braddock's advance guard of light infantry as they are crossing the Monongahela. When their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage, spots the French in the trees, he orders his men to engage. Despite the great distance between the two forces, the British managed to kill a few French with their first volley, including the French force's commander, Captain Bugeaud. Upon seeing their captain fall, the Frenchmen lose their spirit and begin fleeing back to the fort. Their Indian allies, however, are unfazed by Bugeaud's death, rapidly taking up fighting positions in the trees. Screaming their war cries, they unleash a venomous, unfettered assault on the fully exposed and thinly stretched British column, the attack quickly breaking their spirit. Meanwhile, another French officer, Captain Dumas, rallies the remaining Frenchmen and they join in the fight. Within seconds, Gage's light fighters are overwhelmed. For the French and Indian forces, it is akin to shooting fish in a barrel. As droves of British soldiers fall, warriors run from the tree line, swiftly scalping their heads and nailing their bloody scalps on the surrounding trees, the psychological impact crushing the Brits. With their discipline and fighting spirit broken, the British spiral into a confused state of retreat. All the while, Indian warriors screaming their battle cries as they race through the forest after Gage's fleeing men. One after another, Gage's light fighters fall. As they retreat down the narrow road, they run headlong into Braddock's column. They had quickened their pace when they heard the gunfire and now find themselves in a quickly escalating battle. Although Braddock's forces outnumber the French, their elongated and highly exposed column immediately finds themselves on the defense. Making matters worse, the British, who are accustomed to traditional European warfare, are completely ill-prepared for the guerrilla-style warfare they are now facing. As Gage's light fighters and the front of the column collide on the narrow roadway, they once again find themselves surrounded. Like ducks on a pond, their enemy picks them off from the concealment of the trees. With shots ringing out from every direction, many of the British are shot by their own men in the confusion of the crossfire melee. As the British death toll rises, the French and their allies advance, pushing Braddock's forces back. They push them so far back, they run into the British supply train, overwhelming Captain Hugh Waddell's Wagoneers of North Carolina. As they are being overrun, several of the Carolinians, including one Daniel Boone, his cousin Daniel Morgan, and their good friend John Finlay, narrowly escape death by abandoning their wagons and fleeing. 12 years later, Finlay will take Boone on his first hunting trip to Kentucky. This eventually leads to Boone becoming one of America's first and most beloved folk heroes. As for Daniel Morgan, he will later serve under Washington during the American Revolution as one of his most essential generals. Looking to rally his troops, General Braddock rides forward, encouraging his officers to reform their ranks and hold their ground. While doing so, his horse is shot out from under him. Undeterred, he valiantly gets to his feet and mounts another. Moments later, that horse is shot out from under him as well. Meanwhile, his officers' efforts to reform their ranks prove fatal. Lining them up, rather than taking cover, they leave their men exposed. Lined up like tin cans, their enemy picks them off one after another from the thick forest in which they hide. The Virginians holding up the rear race forward to join the fight. However, unlike the British regulars, years of fighting Indians has taught them to counterattack from the cover of trees. Unfortunately, this leads to disastrous results as the British regulars mistake them for the enemy. As the battle rages, the British casualties mount. Despite the loss of nearly all their officers, the British troops rally. Forming ragtag platoons, they band together, holding their ground with relentless frays of return volleys. As his troops rally, Braddock hopes their heroic display will somehow cause the enemy to retreat. But this is not to be. 3 hours into the battle, Braddock is shot in the lung, quite possibly by one of his own men. Badly wounded, he is carried to the rear of the column. In his absence, there are no remaining officers to shout out orders, and the British ranks begin to crumble once again. Making matters worse, when they reach the Monongahela, the battle escalates as they are met by Indian warriors attacking with hatchets and knives. The battle now an all-out bloody free-for-all, and the ill-prepared Brits are getting slaughtered. It is a hand-to-hand combat bloodbath. Severely wounded and seeing that his senior officers have all but perished, Braddock turns to his last hope, aide-de-camp George Washington. Struggling to breathe, the general raises a hand in his direction, his lips slowly moving, but no words coming out. The roar of mayhem all around them, Washington shouts, "Sir, your orders!" With Braddock still struggling to breathe, Washington moves closer, repeating his question. Struggling now to hold up his head, Braddock gazes at him, face pale, eyes weak. "Washington." Washington leans in. "I'm here, sir." "It's up to you. Do what you must." The young aide peers into his dying commander's eyes. "I shall do my best, sir." With that, Washington runs to his horse, leaping upon his back. Taking the reins, he hears Braddock shout with his last bit of strength, "Save my men!" Forgetting his excruciatingly painful dysentery, he gathers himself atop his mount, and with great calm and poise, races into the battle. Within seconds, he is knee-deep in the fighting, surrounded by the dead and dying. Quickly assessing the situation, he dashes his steed to the front line. Along the way, he orders stragglers to form lines and stay in the fight. "I need you men to hold this position! Lay down fire into that tree line there on the left!" Considering he is not one of their officers, the men just stare at him wide-eyed. "Do it now, if you want to live! And for God's sake, take cover!" Without a word, the dozen or so men take up defensive positions and begin laying down fire on the left tree line as ordered. Continuing to the front line, Washington rides through the melee, gathering men, forming them into small firing platoons. "You men, hold that right flank! And for God's sake, find some cover!" Caught in the middle of the makeshift road, and with no other cover, the men take up firing positions behind the bodies of their fallen brethren. Hell-bent on surviving, they work as a team, alternating between firing and reloading. Exposed atop his mount in the middle of the fighting, Washington scans the battlefield. He spies a band of his soldiers scattering to the rear, leaving an opening for enemy penetration, and he kicks his heels into his mount's sides, dashing forward to re-establish their defense. His men are fleeing toward him, running for their lives, and he brings his steed to an abrupt halt, yelling at the group of infantrymen to his right, "Sergeant!" They are holding their position, bullets whizzing about. Exploding muskets and ricochets heard from every direction. Their sergeant turns to him wide-eyed. A man to his right takes a shot to his forehead and dead drops to the ground at his feet. He and Washington glance at him, then re-engage their eyes. "Sergeant, have your men focus their fire there, with an alternating line." He points at the enemy position to his left. "I need a steady volley on that position, and be ready to move." "Yes, sir." He turns to his men. "Form an alternating line, and fix your fire there. An alternating line. We need a steady volley. Fight or die, men! Fight or die!" As his sergeant barks out orders, Washington rides to his left at what remains of his front line. As he comes to a halt, his mount rears. Grasping the reins, he rides it out until his horse returns to all fours. Spinning his steed around, he points at his newly formed firing line, shouting at the remaining tattered line. "You men, on my command, fall back behind that line! Sergeant, have your men ready to move!" Initially, the shaken group just look at him shell-shocked. Washington signals his new firing line, and their muskets erupt as they lay down a steady barrage of suppressive fire. Washington turns to the group of stragglers. "Now,
Fall back! Move! Move! Move!
The men leap into action, falling back at breakneck speed. As Washington turns his mount to lead the retreat, his horse is shot out from under him, tossing him to the blood-soaked ground. 2 soldiers rush to his aid, helping him to his feet. Painfully, he retreats on foot with his men towards the suppressive fire line. Stopping short of the line, he turns and shouts through the deafening battle, pointing,
"Here! Take up positions here! From your knees! Alternating fire! Steady volleys to your front! Fire! Fire! Fire!"
Inspired by this unknown aid, Braddock's men come together, fighting with all they have for the men to their left and right, each man's life dependent upon the other. Grabbing the reins of an abandoned horse, Washington swings his leg over the saddle and rides back into the fray of the right front flank, shouting at the soldiers he passes along the way.
"Fire and retreat! Fire and retreat!"
When he reaches his last platoon on the right front flank, he repeats the command. The sergeant nods and waves, then barks out the orders. The retreat is methodical, firing, retreating, reloading, firing, retreating, and reloading again. As the group rejoins the column, Washington rides through the battle, orchestrating the scattered soldiers' safe retreat to the column. Racing across the battlefield, his horse is shot out from under him, throwing him to the ground like a man tossed from a moving train. After landing atop the bodies of 3 of his fallen men, he rolls to an upright position covered in blood. From his knees, he reorients himself with the battlefield. Finding his bearing, he jumps to his feet and runs towards his men, methodically leading them to the rear guard. With most of his men now back with the column, Washington reestablishes order in the ranks. He orders the sergeants to form their men into a firing line and lay down fire. Under a barrage of bullets whizzing through the air like mosquitoes, the remaining stragglers retreat to safety. Proving his grit under a hail of fire, Washington clears his surviving forces from the battle-stricken roadway and reestablishes their defensive line. He orders his sergeants to hold the line, then he rushes back to check on his commander. He finds Braddock laying in the bed of a wagon.
"Sir, order is restored, and a defensive line firmly in place."
Laying still, Braddock blinks his eyes slowly.
"Scan the forest and retrieve my men."
While Washington had cleared the soldiers from the vulnerable road, many are still struggling to make their way back through the bush, scattered by the clash of forces, confusion, and disarray. Ignoring his painful dysentery, Washington, with a small band of volunteers, returns to the forest on foot. Fighting their way through the trees and bush on their left flank, they come upon a group of pinned-down stragglers. One group after another, Washington's team repatriates the men, forming them into a cohesive fighting force. Together, they make their way through the maze of forest and bodies back to the safety of the main column. With the left flank clear, Washington and his team of volunteers race into the forest on the right flank. Repeating their actions, they bring salvation and direction to those scattered to the wind, leading them safely back to the column. Upon their return, a soldier he guided to safety approaches him.
"Excuse me, sir."
Mind reeling, Washington turns to the battle-weary soldier. He is covered with blood.
"Yes, Private." "Thank you, sir."
Washington tilts his head slightly.
For saving us, sir. We were in the pit of hell, and you pulled us from it. Thank you, sir."
The private comes to attention with a sharp salute. Washington salutes back.
"You needn't thank me, Private. I was doing my duty just as you were." "All due respect, sir. We were just following you. Never before have I witnessed such bravery."
With a raise of his brow, Washington lets out a sigh.
"On this day we have all performed bravely. The fact that we are talking about it is proof of that. I'm no scholar, sir, but I'd say the proof is the 4 bullet holes in your coat."
Washington looks down at his coat to find no less than 4 bullet holes. The grateful soldier continues.
"Call it what you will, sir, but my brothers and me call it bravery, and we'll follow you into any battle." Then, with his musket at his left side, the private snaps Washington a salute. He returns the gesture, and the private executes an about-face and returns to his fellow soldiers. As he walks away, Washington peers down at his coat. In that moment, he realizes it had been a miracle he had survived. What the private said was true. Despite his painful dysentery, he had rallied Braddock's dismantled forces and returned them to safety, all the while dodging death on no less than 4 occasions. And yet, he is completely unharmed, bruised and battered, but not broken. Remarkably, he is one of only a few of Braddock's aides to survive the battle. That evening, under the cover of darkness, Washington leads the surviving column in a tactical retreat to Philadelphia. Fortunately, they are not spotted or pursued by the enemy. When they reach the rear reserve and supply units, their commander, Colonel Thomas Dumas, assumes command of the column. Seeing there was no possibility of capturing Fort Duquesne, Dumas orders all their extra supplies, wagons, and cannons to be destroyed before continuing to Philadelphia. In the end, of the 1,300 members of Braddock's expedition, 457 are killed, with more than 450 wounded, including General Braddock, who on July 13th, just 4 days after the battle, succumbs to his wounds. His men bury him just off the road in the meadow near Old Fort Necessity. At final count, 26 of Braddock's 86 officers are dead, 37 wounded. Of the 50 women on the expedition, half are taken prisoner. Only 4 return home. The rest, dead on the battlefield with Braddock's men. Of the 891 French, 39 are dead, 57 wounded. Almost a year to the day after Washington's crushing defeat at Fort Necessity, the French crushed the British yet again, slaughtering them at the Battle of Monongahela. The massacre, which comes to be known as Braddock's defeat, serves as a major setback for the British war effort. It is arguably their most disastrous military loss of the 18th century. Fort Cumberland, Maryland Colony, late summer, 1755. Upon his return to Virginia, Washington issues his report to Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie. In it, he is both harsh and critical, stating that while the British officers had fought bravely, their cowardly dogs of soldiers did not. He goes on to say the Virginians, on the other hand, proved innocent of said cowardice, stating they behaved like men and died like soldiers. After the battle, Washington is praised for regaining control of the British column and leading their retreat. Thusly, he is dubbed the hero of Monongahela, while at the same time, the Virginia Regiment is exalted for their bravery for rushing into the face of certain death. In August, as acknowledgment of Washington's gallant behavior, Dinwiddie and Virginia's House of Burgesses restructures the colony's defenses. In doing so, Washington is awarded a regiment of 1,200 men, promoted to full colonel, and made commander-in-chief of all Virginia forces. He is only 23. Strangely, Governor Dinwiddie originally designates Fort Cumberland, Maryland, as the Virginia Regiment's headquarters. For Washington, however, this is troubling. Fort Cumberland is commanded by John Dagworthy, a British captain who outranks him by virtue of his regular army status. In light of that fact, Washington knows other arrangements will have to be made. In his first step towards resolving the problem, he leaves Fort Cumberland in September of 1755, his justification for which is basing his regiment at the more strategic location of Winchester, Virginia. After establishing himself in Winchester, he begins embarking on recruiting trips to fill the ranks of his regiment. During this time, he frequently travels through Williamsburg, enabling himself to talk face-to-face with Dinwiddie about the unjust arrangement of serving under a captain. Initially,
those conversations fall on deaf ears. However, after Captain Dagworthy makes the mistake of refusing to supply Washington's regiment, Dinwiddie concedes. Considering Dagworthy's supplies have been paid for and provided by the people of Virginia, he comes to agree with his new commander-in-chief. The Governor's Office, Boston, Massachusetts Colony, Fall, 1755. Seeking to remedy the rank and command conflict between British regulars and provincial officers, Dinwiddie sends a letter to Major General Braddock's acting replacement, Massachusetts Governor William Shirley. In the letter, he requests his Virginia officers be given royal commissions to eliminate the problem. Shirley, however, hoping to avoid the issue, does not respond. Unwilling to give up on the matter, Dinwiddie sends Washington to make the request in person. Upon being received, Washington successfully lays out his case. Shirley agrees, issuing a decree declaring that rank is rank, regardless of whether the officer is a member of the regular or provincial forces. After his meeting with Shirley, Washington returns to Winchester, arriving on Friday, October 10th, as full, unimpeded Commander-in-Chief of the Virginia forces.